My name is Marla Trenton. After 20 years of loyal service, I was fired without warning. No meeting, no thank you, just an email. I sat frozen, humiliated, replaced like a broken office chair. But when I uncovered the truth behind my dismissal, fraud, manipulation, betrayal, I didn't stay silent. I stood up, and I made sure they listened. Please stay with me until the end of this story, and then tell me, was I right to speak out? Or should I have walked away in silence? Your advice means more than you know. It was a Tuesday morning in late October. One of those gray, slouchy Midwest mornings where the sun takes its sweet time getting up, if it ever shows at all. I remember the chill in the air, not quite winter yet, but cold enough that the windows of my car were fogged over when I pulled into the parking garage on level 3. I had a half-full travel mug of coffee and half of a headache I'd been nursing since Sunday night. The elevator smelled like burnt popcorn. It always did. That was one of those little things you stop noticing after 20 years in the same place. The posters in the hallway hadn't changed in 5 years. Safety reminders, diversity initiatives, a faded photo from a company picnic no one could quite remember. All of it so familiar, so utterly normal. I couldn't have imagined that within 90 minutes, I'd be walking out of that building for the last time. I took the same route to my desk, waved to Greg from compliance, who always arrived early to avoid traffic. He nodded with a mouthful of granola bar and went back to his screen. I dropped my coat over the back of my chair and opened my laptop. I remember that slight buzzing sound it always made before the fan kicked in, the hum of the printer from across the room, the smell of that terrible cinnamon vanilla air freshener someone in admin insisted on keeping plugged in year-round, the way the corner of my desk always caught my bag strap. All of it. The mundane, quiet rhythm of another Tuesday. I didn't see it coming. Not in any real way. At 9:06 a.m., my Outlook pinged with a new email. Subject line: notification of position elimination. I remember staring at it for a few seconds, thinking it had to be spam or some kind of error. Maybe something meant for a different Marla, or a test email someone in HR had accidentally sent to the wrong distribution list. But it wasn't. The message was short. Cold. It said my role was no longer aligned with Vireon's operational goals and had been eliminated, effective immediately. There would be no transition period. No exit interview. No meeting. No warning. It thanked me for my service. That was it. I scrolled to the bottom, half expecting a joke or a link to another message that made it all make sense. There wasn't one. Just a number to call if I had questions about final compensation or benefits transition. No call from my manager. No follow-up from Kenton, the man who once told me, in front of our whole team, that I was the spine of this operation. I didn't cry. I didn't slam my laptop shut or storm into anyone's office. I didn't say a word. I just sat there for a long moment, blinking at the screen, my fingers still hovering over the keyboard like they were waiting for instructions. Around me, the office carried on like it always had, printer humming, phones ringing, someone microwaving their breakfast sandwich down the hall. But something inside me detached. Like a wire had been clipped. Like I was floating slightly above the desk, watching someone else's Tuesday unfold. And then, without saying a word, I opened the shared drive and located one of the folders I'd maintained for years. Contract oversight. Vendor audit backup. Just a plain folder with subfolders for each vendor cycle, copies of invoices, audit logs, and summaries I kept as part of my own checks. Nothing illegal. Nothing secret. But detailed. Painstakingly detailed. I dropped a copy onto a flash drive I kept in my desk drawer. I don't even know why I did it. Just something in my gut told me, don't leave empty-handed. There wasn't a formal exit. No security escort. No email announcement. I walked to the elevator like I was going to grab a late breakfast. I passed a few coworkers, people I'd trained, mentored, covered for on sick days, and none of them looked up. Why would they? It was just another Tuesday. Except it wasn't. When I stepped out of the front door, the wind hit me square in the face. It was colder than I remembered. Or maybe I just felt it more, now that I wasn't walking in with purpose. Earl, the older gentleman who'd worked security since before I started, gave me a small wave from behind the glass. "You all right, hon?" he asked. I smiled. Or at least tried to. Yeah, I said, barely louder than the wind. Just heading out. He nodded like he didn't believe me, but he let it go. And I walked out of that building like I was never there. But the thing they didn't know was that I never left empty-handed. The first few days felt like free fall. I wasn't sleeping much, barely eating. I'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before I ever touched it. The quiet in my apartment was deafening. It wasn't just the loss of routine, it was something deeper, like I'd been unplugged from a system I didn't realize I'd fused into. People talk about burnout or stress or office politics like it's background noise. But when your identity's been wrapped around a company for 20 years, getting dropped without warning doesn't just sting, it erases something. I kept asking myself, how did I not see it coming? And then I realized maybe I had. I just didn't want to believe it. There were signs. I'd started a vendor streamlining initiative 6 months earlier, worked weekends, ran the numbers, pitched a process overhaul. 2 weeks before launch, the project was reassigned to a junior manager who barely knew the system. No explanation, just a vague, "We're reallocating resources." I told myself it was politics, that Kenton had his reasons. Then there were the meetings. At first it was small things, forgotten invites, changed Zoom links. Then whole strategy sessions I didn't even know happened until someone mentioned them in passing. I brought it up once to Kenton, half joking. He gave me that polished smile he was famous for and said, "I don't want you worrying too much about internal buzz. You've earned your focus. Just stay the course." That phrase haunted me. Stay the course. Stay where you are. Don't ask questions. Don't stir the water. The day of my 20-year anniversary, they gave me a pin. A literal lapel pin. No speech. No lunch. Kenton didn't even show. "Family emergency," someone said. I sat through the cupcake reception with a paper plate and a sinking feeling I couldn't quite name. That should have been my wake-up call. I started spiraling. Was I too rigid? Too by the book? Maybe I didn't play the game well enough. I've never been the one to schmooze or flatter. I believed doing the job well was enough. Maybe that made me disposable. I don't know what made me open LinkedIn that night. Maybe boredom. Maybe habit. Maybe I was looking for a sign I wasn't completely adrift. But there it was, an article shared by someone I hadn't seen in years. Joelle Kinsley. The name hit me like a bell. She used to be director of operations before me. Left suddenly. No real explanation. Rumors swirled, something about disagreements with upper management, but nothing ever confirmed. Her article was titled, "The Cost of Silence in the Workplace." Short but sharp. She talked about how systems protect themselves at the expense of the people who build them. About how speaking up gets you framed as difficult, but staying quiet eats you alive. I stared at that post for a long time. Then I sent her a message. I didn't overthink it. Just a couple lines. "Hi Joelle. I came across your post. I think I'm living part of it right now. Not sure why I'm writing. Just thanks." I didn't expect her to reply. She responded within 30 minutes. "Marla. I remember you. Let's get coffee." My treat. You pick the place. We met the next afternoon at Hearth and Light, a small, wood-paneled cafe near the river. The kind of place with mismatched mugs and good lemon scones. She looked almost exactly as I remembered, just grayer at the temples, eyes more settled somehow. She hugged me like we were old friends, even though we barely knew each other. We talked for 2 hours. I told her everything, well, most of it. The email. The silence. Kenton. The way it felt like they were scrubbing me out of the story. She nodded through it all like she'd heard this tune before. "They tried to do the same to me," she said finally, sipping her coffee. Only I pushed back. There was a proposal to cut safety compliance audits by half to save budget. I said no. I wrote a memo. They said I was overstepping. A month later, I was gone. I stared at her, unsure what to say. She leaned forward. "You think they got rid of you because you were unnecessary. That's not how it works. People like you were a threat when we're not compliant. When we notice things we're not supposed to, that's when they move." I let that sink in. Joelle set her mug down, steady. "You kept records, right?" I nodded. Go through them. Not for revenge. For clarity. You might be holding proof of why you're no longer there.
She paused.
I stayed quiet for too long. A nurse lost her job over a supply shortage. I could have stopped if I'd pushed harder. Silence doesn't protect you. It only protects the ones hoping you stay quiet. I didn't speak for a while. My throat tightened. As I walked to my car that afternoon, I kept hearing her words over and over again. You don't have to be quiet to be respected. I think, deep down, I'd always known that. I just didn't believe it could apply to me. The night after meeting Joelle, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind running like it used to during audit season. I kept thinking about what she said, about how the people who get pushed out are often the ones who get too close to the truth. I tried brushing it off as dramatic, but something about it stuck with me. So, around 2 a.m., I got up, made a cup of peppermint tea, and pulled my laptop out of the closet. I still had partial access to the internal network. Vireon gives a 7-day grace window after termination for certain remote users. I hadn't touched it since I walked out, but something told me not to wait any longer. My login worked. One click, and I was back inside the system I'd managed for 2 decades, like a ghost walking the halls of a house I no longer owned. I opened the vendor archive I used to maintain, the same one I'd copied to my flash drive before leaving. The structure was familiar. Each folder labeled by quarter, subfolders by supplier. Most of it looked as I remembered. But something caught my eye. There was a new directory I didn't recognize. Buried under Q3 vendor addendums, a section I never created. I clicked it open. Red Grove Logistics. I froze. I knew our approved vendors backward and forward. Red Grove wasn't on that list. Ever. There were 4 contracts, each dated within the last 4 months. All labeled Emergency Logistics Routing, Tier 3 facilities. I scanned the PDFs. The services described were vague: supply chain buffering, infrastructure mitigation, transportation compliance support. Nothing tangible. Just buzzwords with 6-figure invoices. Each invoice had been approved by Kenton. And the authorized signer for Red Grove? Brian Surridge. Same last name. I'd never heard of him before, but the odds of that being a coincidence? Practically zero. I stared at the screen, heart pounding like it wanted out of my chest. I clicked through the payment logs. The transfers were scheduled like clockwork, $87, $500 every 3 weeks, just under the internal audit threshold that would have flagged it automatically. Kenton had signed off on every single one. This wasn't a mistake. It was a system. A controlled flow of money routed through a ghost vendor, signed off by a director who had just made sure the one person who would have spotted it, me, was no longer around to ask questions. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. The longer I looked, the more it all made sense. The reassigned projects. The sudden coldness. The manufactured silence. They weren't phasing me out for performance or strategy. They were eliminating a threat. I pushed back from the table and stood up too fast. The room spun slightly. I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to breathe. Anger flared behind my eyes, but fear came just as fast, pressing in like a vice. What if I was wrong? What if I misunderstood? What if this backfired? But deeper than the fear was something sharper: clarity. This wasn't about me feeling betrayed anymore. This was about fraud, abuse of power, stealing from a company under the guise of leadership. I needed to act. I pulled out the flash drive from my bag, checked that the Red Grove contracts were already on it, and began copying the rest of the payment history. I backed it up to 2 cloud accounts I barely used. I made a PDF log of every download. I was 5 files in when my connection cut. A pop-up appeared on the screen. Access denied. Session terminated by IT administrator. 30 seconds later, an automated email landed in my inbox from Vireon IT. Dear former user, per directive from Executive Operations, your temporary access privileges have been rescinded effective immediately. If you have questions regarding this action, please contact HR. My stomach dropped. They knew. Somewhere in that system, someone had seen what I was looking at. Maybe it was a tracking script, maybe a manual flag, didn't matter. They knew I was back in. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. I debated calling Joelle, but it was past midnight and I needed to think. I stood there for a long time, watching the blinking cursor on the email screen, realizing how exposed I was. This was no longer speculation. They were covering their tracks. And now they knew I might be holding the match. I closed my laptop, heart racing, and walked slowly to the window. Outside, the street was empty except for one lonely trash can that had tipped in the wind. That's when I understood I couldn't undo this. I'd crossed into a place where pretending I didn't know would make me complicit. I didn't ask for this fight, but maybe that was the point. Sometimes, the truth doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just shows up and dares you to look it in the eye. The next morning, I called Joelle. My voice was still scratchy from not sleeping, and I felt like I was making the call with someone else's hands. She picked up on the second ring. "I figured you'd call," she said, not unkindly. "What happened?" I walked her through everything. The fake vendor, the contracts, the name, Brian Surridge, the cancelled access. All of it. She didn't interrupt much. I could hear her scribbling notes or maybe tapping a pen against her coffee mug. When I was done, there was a pause on the line that stretched a little too long. Then she said, "Listen to me. You send this to internal channels, they'll bury it. HR, compliance, IT, they all roll up under the same people. If you really want this to go anywhere, you have to go above them. Calderon Group, the parent company." I exhaled slowly, pressing my thumb into my temple. "Do I even have a way to reach them?" "I might," she said. "There's someone I used to know, Brady Chan. He's with their internal audit division in Chicago. You wouldn't go through official channels, not at first. Just send what you have to the whistleblower inbox. They monitor it." "And then what?" I asked. Joelle didn't answer right away. "Then you wait. And you be ready." There was another long pause. "You want to know something I never told anyone?" she added, softer now. "Back when I was still at Vireon, I started suspecting something. I didn't have a name or a company, but I noticed patterns, payment trails that didn't match project timelines. Vendors getting approved faster than normal. I flagged it once in a meeting. Kenton gave me the same look I imagine he gave you when you asked about those meetings they forgot to invite you to. I didn't have to confirm it. I'd seen that look. Casual indifference with a sharp edge hiding just beneath the surface." Joelle continued. "I didn't push. I had my doubts. But I didn't have proof, and I didn't want to be labeled the problem. You know how that goes." I did. After we hung up, I sat there staring at the blinking cursor in my inbox. I opened a new email draft, paused, then opened a private browser window instead. I created a new account under a pseudonym I'd used once in college for a class project. Something generic. Harmless. From that address, I composed a message to the Calderon whistleblower inbox. I included everything. Copies of the contracts, payment schedules, the Redgrove files, the invoices Kenton approved. I laid it out as cleanly as I could. No ranting, no accusations. Just data. I attached the documents and set the email to send in 24 hours, just in case I changed my mind. Or something changed for me. Then I backed up everything to an external drive and locked it in the fireproof box under my bed. One copy went to a cloud folder. Another was printed and sealed in an envelope I handed to a retired paralegal I knew through my church. She didn't ask questions, just nodded and promised to mail it to her cousin, who happened to be a labor law attorney in Ohio, if anything happened to me. It sounds dramatic, I know. But the moment you realize someone with power is willing to erase you quietly, it changes the way you move through the world. Later that day, Joelle sent me Brady's contact info. Just an email address and a message that said, "Use this only if the official route gets ignored." That night, I sat in the dark with my phone in my hand for almost an hour. I kept scrolling through job boards, opening and closing LinkedIn, typing things like project consultant or operation strategy, and then deleting them. I knew, deep down, if I went through with this, there was no safe return. No clean version of this story I could tell a hiring manager. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that staying silent would be worse. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not tomorrow. But eventually. Because if I knew and I walked away, I'd carry that weight forever. And I'd lose something I wasn't sure I could get back. Myself. By the time the email sent itself at 3:15 p.m. the next day, I felt oddly calm. Not safe. Not certain. But settled. I had done what I could. Not for revenge. Not even for justice, if I'm being honest. I did it because I needed to look at myself in the mirror and know I wasn't still playing by rules that were never meant to protect me. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then whispered out loud, as if saying it could anchor it in the world. I spent 20 years protecting a system that never protected me. Maybe it's time I protect what matters, the truth. I try to go back to something resembling normal. I told my sister I was between projects, smiled politely at my neighbor who always asked too many questions, even let the barista at Hearth and Light believe I was taking a sabbatical. But under the surface, I wasn't resting, I was watching. Waiting. Thinking 5 steps ahead. And, if I'm honest, bracing for the blowback. Every time the phone rang with an unknown number, I flinched. Every time I checked the mail, I half expected to find a cease and desist letter or some vague legal threat folded inside a manila envelope. I kept asking myself, what if they trace it back to me? What if they accuse me of accessing files I wasn't supposed to? What if they make me the problem? And worse, what if people believe them? I've seen how quickly reputations shift in this industry. A whisper in the wrong meeting, and suddenly, your 2 decades of clean record mean nothing. You become the former employee with an axe to grind. I didn't want to be that story. I didn't want to be anyone's cautionary tale. So when Joelle called, I almost didn't pick up. But something in my gut told me to answer. They moved, she said the second I said hello. I stepped into the hallway, away from the window. What do you mean? Brady got back to me. He didn't say much, but he confirmed Calderon opened a quiet audit. Internal only for now. My knees went weak. I sat down on the steps. That's fast, I said. It's not just because of you, Joelle added. Turns out Redgrove's name came up in 2 other divisions. West Coast and South Central. Similar invoices. Same patterns. I closed my eyes. You're saying Kenton wasn't acting alone? No, she said. He was part of a structure. Possibly one of the architects. I didn't say anything. I was too busy trying to recalibrate what I thought I knew. I'd spent weeks thinking I was collateral damage in some power reshuffle, maybe even the victim of one man's grudge. But this wasn't personal. It was procedural. And I'd been removed not because I was weak, but because I was inconvenient. I don't know whether to be relieved or more scared. I said finally. You were never the target, Joelle replied. You were the obstacle. I hung up not long after, hands tingling from adrenaline. I felt exposed, but also validated in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I had seen the right cracks, and they tried to patch them by removing me. Later that afternoon, I stopped by Hearth and Light for a coffee I didn't really need. Old habits die hard. As I stood at the pickup counter, I heard someone call my name, softly, like they hoped I wouldn't hear. It was Layla. We hadn't spoken since I left Vireon. She looked the same, pressed blazer, hair pinned neatly, a cautious smile on her face. But her eyes darted, as if scanning for who else might be watching. I didn't know if I should say hi, she said. I didn't know how things ended for you. I offered a tight smile. I think you do. She nodded, eyes on her cup. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For August. I froze. What happened in August? Layla shifted. Her fingers tapped nervously against the cardboard sleeve. Kenton asked me to sign off on the supplemental vendor report while you were on medical leave. Said you'd be okay with it, said it was a formality. I didn't think twice. I never saw your initials on it later. That's when I started wondering. She looked up at me, finally meeting my eyes. I didn't think it had anything to do with you. I swear. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. But something deep in my chest cracked. Of course. Of course he used my absence to slip through his fake documentation. He couldn't manipulate me directly, so he worked around me. And then he made sure I wouldn't be there to ask why. Thanks for telling me, I said quietly. Layla's voice dropped to a whisper. You weren't the problem, Marla. You were just the one paying attention. She left before I could respond. I sat down at a corner table, my coffee going cold in my hand, the pieces clicking into place in my head like a puzzle I never wanted to solve. It wasn't just Kenton covering his tracks. He was rewriting history, line by line, signature by signature, while the rest of us were too distracted, too tired, or too scared to read between them. And I'd been the only one reading every word. The invitation came by secure email late on a Thursday afternoon. The subject line was vague, internal inquiry participation request, but I knew exactly what it was. Brady Chan from Calderon had warned me something like this might come, but reading it in black and white still sent a chill through my spine. They were asking me to fly to Chicago, not as a whistleblower, not as a former employee, but as a key witness in a confidential internal hearing about Vireon's procurement operations. No titles, no press, just a table, a timeline, and the truth. There wasn't a deadline in the email, just the line. Your cooperation is voluntary, but your insight is critical. Voluntary. That word stuck in my throat like a bone. Because agreeing to this wasn't just about telling the truth, it was about owning it. Owning my part in it, and accepting what it would mean going forward. I couldn't walk into that room and still pretend I might one day return to a normal role in the industry. There'd be no shrinking back once my name was in the room. I stared at my laptop for a long time, the screen dimming once before I moved the mouse again. And then I heard Joelle's voice, almost like she was in the room with me. Imposing silence to protect your image only keeps someone else's mask in place. I booked the flight that night. The next morning, I packed a carry-on like I was going to a networking event. Neutrals. Safe shoes. A folder labeled Market Analysis in case TSA wanted to know why I had 50 pages of spreadsheets in my bag. I told my sister I was attending a career counseling seminar. She offered to pick me up from the airport Sunday night. I said I might extend the trip, depending on how it went. The truth was, I didn't know how it would go. I arrived at Calderon Group's headquarters in downtown Chicago on a Monday. A glass tower that looked like it was trying too hard not to intimidate people. The receptionist checked my ID, offered me a visitor's badge, and escorted me to a small meeting room on the 27th floor. No windows. Just a long table, a whiteboard, and a coffee cart that smelled like burnt hazelnut syrup. Brady was already there along with two others, one from Calderon Legal, the other from Ethics and Compliance. They weren't unkind, but they were clearly trained to ask without revealing. I respected that. I'd done enough vendor interviews in my time to know how to keep my answers sharp and clean. For the next 3 hours, I walked them through everything I had, how I discovered the Red Grove contracts, how I verified the addresses didn't exist, how I traced the approvals to Kenton, and how the amounts had been split across fiscal periods to avoid audit thresholds. I showed them the payment logs, the email approvals, even Layla's text message. I explained my role, how I'd built the internal structure that tracked vendor legitimacy, how that system had been overwritten in Q3 under executive direction. They didn't ask me why I hadn't come forward sooner. They didn't need to. I could see it on their faces, the slow dawning of a pattern they'd suspected but hadn't yet been able to prove. When I finished, Brady leaned back and nodded. We've been collecting data from the accounting servers. Your documentation lines up with anomalies we've already flagged. But what you've brought fills in the gaps. The woman from legal tapped her pen twice on the folder in front of her. We're planning to initiate a formal inquiry next week. Senior leaders from 3 regions will be summoned, including Kenton Surridge and Brian Surridge. I swallowed hard. She paused, looking straight at me. We'd like to know if you're willing to be present. As a formal witness. Your account will carry more weight than a digital packet alone. There was a silence in the room. It wasn't heavy, exactly, just charged, like static before a summer storm. I thought about my resume. About every interview I'd never be called for once word got out. I thought about the people I used to mentor who might hear my name and not know what to believe. I thought about Kenton, calm and smiling, telling me to stay the course. And I thought about the kind of woman I wanted to be at 53. I didn't hesitate. I've kept my head down for 20 years, I said, steady. This time, I'll keep my spine straight instead. Brady didn't smile. He just nodded. I think he understood that this wasn't a moment of courage. It was a moment of clarity. I signed the consent form, packed up my notes, and walked out into the Chicago afternoon. The sky had turned gray again, just like it was the morning I was fired. Only this time, I wasn't the one being sent out. This time, I was the one stepping in. They scheduled the hearing on a Wednesday, midweek, mid-morning. Just enough time for everyone involved to feel the weight of it creeping in without having the distraction of the weekend to soften the nerves. I arrived 15 minutes early, folder in hand, hair pulled back tighter than usual. No jewelry, no flair. Just the facts. I hadn't seen Kenton since the day I walked out of Vireon. Part of me wondered if I'd feel nervous when I did. But as I stepped into that beige, overly sanitized boardroom at Calderon's Midwest ethics office, what I felt was something different. Steady. He walked in 5 minutes late, of course. Not rushed. Not flustered. He strolled in like he owned the air we were all breathing. He gave a tight nod to the Calderon panel, made direct eye contact with no one else, until his gaze landed on me. And there it was. The flicker. Not surprise, not shock. Just that tiny muscle twitch in his cheek that betrayed recognition he hadn't planned for. Like a chess player who just realized the queen he sacrificed 3 turns ago was still in play. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. I wasn't informed that Miss Trenton would be joining, he said, still looking straight at me. One of the internal compliance officers answered before I could. Miss Trenton is here in an official capacity. We've reviewed her records and findings. This is a closed session under executive authority. Kenton smiled. Polite, professional, paper-thin. Well, I'm happy to clarify any misunderstandings. I assume this relates to our vendor transitions in Q3? There's been a lot of reshuffling. Timelines get compressed. Documents get misfiled. These things happen. I let him talk. He kept going, throwing out words like oversight, delegation, workflow stress. His voice had that practice calm, the kind he used when closing a deal or managing a minor crisis. Then they asked if I had anything to add. I opened my folder and slid a printed email across the table toward him. It was a contract approval, his digital signature right there. Below it, the vendor name, Red Grove Logistics. I placed a second sheet beside it, an excerpt from a Federal Business Registry search confirming that Red Grove had no license, no location, and no verified operating history in any U.S. state. Silence. Kenton didn't reach for the papers. Just stared at them like they were in a language he didn't speak. I assume this came from a backup file, he said finally. If so, I'd question its current validity. Files can be manipulated. I leaned forward, keeping my voice even. That file was accessed from your executive drive. Timestamped, IP verified, and cross-referenced with 3 other documents that all follow the same pattern. Different projects. Same scheme. He turned toward the panel. This is exactly the kind of witch hunt we create when internal channels are bypassed. Ms. Trenton was dismissed due to restructuring. Now she's rebranding that as retaliation. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't flinch. No, I said. You used a phantom company to move over $300,000 in false contracts through the system, and you did it by removing the one person whose job was to ask questions. His lips tightened. Then, leaning back in his chair, he smiled not kindly, not sincerely. You still think you're a supervisor, he said, almost laughing. You still think this is your role, even after being let go. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe you never learned when it was time to step aside. I let him sit with that for a beat. Then I replied, calm and clean. No. I just learned that not all promotions are upward. Some people rise by standing their ground. There was no applause. No dramatic gasp. Just the quiet buzz of the fluorescent lights and the weight of his words falling flat between us. The panelists thanked us, asked Kenton to wait outside. I stayed behind while they reviewed the documentation, once more. After about 10 minutes, they informed me that effective immediately, Kenton, along with 2 regional executives tied to the same approval pattern, would be placed on administrative suspension pending a formal criminal investigation. I nodded. No relief. No victory. Just confirmation. I gathered my folder, buttoned my coat, and walked out without saying another word. The hall outside was cold and quiet. Not sterile like punishment, more like silence after an echo. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. As I stepped into the elevator and watched the numbers count down, I felt something let go inside me. A tether I hadn't realized was still tied. It wasn't revenge. It was realignment. A week after the hearing, I was back in Minneapolis, sitting in my usual corner at Hearth and Light with a coffee that actually tasted good for once. Maybe it was just me. Maybe the bitterness had finally loosened its grip. I wasn't sure if it was peace I felt, exactly, but something close enough to breathe through. Brady called that morning. His voice was brisk but careful. The way people speak when they know what they're about to say carries weight. "It's official," he said. "The board authorized a formal criminal investigation. The case is now with our Ethics and Compliance Division, and the DOJ is being notified." I didn't say anything right away, just nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Kenton has been suspended without pay, and all access to internal systems has been revoked. The internal statement went out this morning. I closed my eyes, letting the words settle in the space around me. Brady continued, "We'll keep your identity protected on all external communications, unless the investigation escalates to federal proceedings. If that changes, I'll let you know first." "Thank you," I said and meant it. Before he hung up, he added something I hadn't expected. "You should know, your actions might have saved this company more than just money. They might have saved our name." That one stuck with me. I stayed at the cafe long after the call ended, watching people come and go, hearing the hiss of the espresso machine, watching sunlight spill unevenly across the counter. It was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. There, in that exact seat where I once sat feeling small and erased, I finally said it to myself. I don't need anyone to protect me. I just needed to stop protecting what was wrong. It wasn't some grand declaration, just a truth I'd been circling for years, but never quite owned. Later that day, I called Joelle. She answered like she'd been waiting for the call. "I wanted to thank you," I said. "Not just for the help, but for saying what I couldn't admit to myself." There was a pause. Then I told her what I'd been afraid to say out loud. For a long time, I thought being quiet was the same as being loyal. But I get it now. Silence doesn't mean integrity. It means you're choosing not to interfere with the damage. Joelle didn't interrupt. When she finally spoke, her voice was warm and low. "Took me too long to learn that, too. I'm just glad you didn't wait as long as I did." 2 days later, an email landed in my inbox from Calderon's executive development team. They offered me a part-time contract position, advisor for ethical policy and internal contract integrity. I'd report directly to a new oversight committee, independent from any regional managers. It wasn't flashy. No corner office, no title to parade on LinkedIn. But it was real, and it meant something. I accepted, with one condition: I would not return to Vireon's building. I'd work remote, on my own terms. If they wanted my expertise, they'd have to accept that I'd no longer lend it to systems I couldn't trust. They agreed. Before my first onboarding session, I pulled out the old Vireon employee badge I'd tucked in the back of a drawer. The one I didn't throw away when I left, for reasons I couldn't quite explain at the time. I looked at the plastic rectangle, the outdated photo, the barcode that no longer worked, and I dropped it into the shredder. Not as an act of anger. Not even finality. Just closure. I wasn't going back. Not to the building, not to the version of myself who spent 2 decades trying to be indispensable in a place that only valued silence. Later that week, I heard from an old colleague that Kenton had hired a legal team. But the evidence was solid. Timed approvals, email trails, false vendor logs. Even Brian Surridge had vanished, last spotted in another state. Calderon froze Redgrove's accounts, recovered 70% of the diverted funds, and launched a company-wide audit of all procurement systems. They used part of the recovered money to start over, retraining managers, rewriting oversight policies, building something more honest from the ashes. I wasn't the hero of that rebuild. I wasn't even at the table for most of it. But I had lit the fuse. And in doing so, I burned off a version of myself I'd carried for too long, composed, agreeable, willing to bite my tongue for the sake of optics and opportunity. That version no longer had a seat at the table. Now, when I open my laptop to meet with the compliance team, I don't feel small. I feel clear. And when people ask what happened at my last company, I don't tell them I was fired. I tell them I left. Because once you reclaim your voice, you don't need permission to use it. It wasn't justice I was after. It was dignity. And this time, I didn't trade it to keep my seat. Sometimes, it's not the loudest moment that changes us. It's the quiet one, when we finally choose to stop shrinking ourselves for the comfort of others. That's what happened to me. And maybe in your own way, it's happened to you too. Have you ever stayed silent when something inside you begged to speak? If this story touched something in you, I'd be grateful to have you with me for the next one. Let's keep walking this road together.